Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from? And what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between? I want to see how far this story can reach. Now, lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The crash of splintering wood jolted Marguerite Dubois awake in the suffocating darkness of her small cabin. 3 months had passed since Sheriff Thomas Dubois had been gunned down in the street by the Kerrigan brothers, and 3 months since his widow had learned that being the law's woman in Redemption Creek meant painting a target on your back that never faded. The moonlight streaming through her window caught the glint of broken glass scattered across her floor, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that they had come for her again. Her trembling hands found the shotgun beside her bed, but the weight of it felt useless against the kind of men who burned down homes for sport and left widows begging in the dust. Through the shattered window, she could see shadows moving like wolves around her property. 3, maybe 4 figures circling her sanctuary with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. The Kerrigan gang had made it clear that killing her husband wasn't enough. They wanted everything he'd stood for erased from existence, starting with the woman foolish enough to love a man who wore a badge. "Come out, little dove," called a voice slick with malice. Buck Kerrigan's drawl carried the same cold amusement it had held the day he'd put 2 bullets in Thomas's chest and watched him die in the street. "We just want to talk about that testimony you gave to the circuit judge last month, about how maybe you remembered things wrong when you pointed your pretty finger at my brothers." Marguerite pressed herself against the wall beside her broken window, the shotgun clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She was 26 years old, alone in a territory where justice died with the man brave enough to enforce it, and she could feel the walls of her small world closing in like a coffin. The testimony had been her attempt to see Thomas's killers hang for their crimes, but all it had accomplished was marking her for a slower, more painful death. The sound of boots on her porch made her heart hammer against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. In the distance, she could hear her mare whinnying in terror from the barn, and she knew they'd already cut off her only means of flight. As the door handle began to turn with deliberate slowness, Marguerite closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to whatever God watched over fools and widows, not for salvation, because she'd stopped believing in miracles the day Thomas bled out in her arms, but for the courage to make them pay a price for whatever they planned to do to her. 6 months earlier, Redemption Creek had been a different kind of hell, the slow-burning kind that consumed souls gradually rather than all at once. Thomas Dubois had ridden into town wearing a badge from the territorial governor and carrying letters of recommendation that spoke of his integrity, his courage, and his stubborn refusal to look the other way when powerful men committed crimes. At 32, he was everything a frontier sheriff should be: tall, steady-handed, and possessed of the kind of quiet authority that made decent folks feel safe and guilty men nervous. Marguerite had been running the town's only school then, teaching 15 children in a one-room building she'd helped construct with her own hands after arriving from New Orleans, with nothing but books, dreams, and the unshakable belief that education could civilize even the wildest frontier. She was beautiful in the way that made men stumble over their own feet, dark hair that caught fire in sunlight, eyes the color of summer storms, and a backbone of pure steel wrapped in silk and lace. But it was her mind that had captured Thomas's attention, the way she could quote Shakespeare and Voltaire while cleaning a rifle or treating a rattlesnake bite. Their courtship had unfolded like something from one of her beloved novels, all stolen glances across the church pews and evening walks past the creek that gave the town its name. Thomas would stop by the schoolhouse each afternoon, ostensibly to check on the children's safety, but really to watch Marguerite work magic with young minds that had never known there was beauty in words and numbers. She would save him coffee in a blue ceramic cup and listen as he talked about his vision for Redemption Creek, a place where families could build futures without fear, where justice meant more than whoever drew fastest or paid best. They married on a crisp October morning with the whole town in attendance, the ceremony held in the schoolhouse because the church was still just a foundation and good intentions. Marguerite wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Thomas wore his best suit with his badge pinned over his heart like a declaration of faith. Judge Morrison, traveling through on circuit, pronounced them husband and wife while children threw wildflowers, and the saloon pianist played Beautiful Dreamer on an ancient piano hauled out for the occasion. For 6 perfect months, they'd built a life that felt like everything they'd dreamed it could be. Thomas kept the peace with more words than bullets, earning respect even from the rougher elements who drifted through town. Marguerite continued teaching while slowly transforming their small cabin into a home filled with books, laughter, and quiet plans for the children they'd have someday. They fell asleep each night wrapped in each other's arms, whispering about the future they were building together one careful day at a time, never knowing that some dreams are too beautiful for this world to let them survive. The morning that changed everything started like any other, with Marguerite brewing coffee in their sunny kitchen, while Thomas checked his guns and prepared for another day of keeping the peace in a town that was finally learning to believe in law and order. She kissed him goodbye at the door, the same ritual they'd followed for 6 months, her fingers lingering on the star-shaped badge that made him a target every time he pinned it to his chest. "Be careful," she whispered against his lips, not knowing it would be the last thing she'd ever say to him as his living wife. The Kerrigan brothers had ridden into Redemption Creek like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, their reputation preceding them like a storm front. Buck was the leader, cold, calculating, with pale eyes that reflected nothing human, and a smile that promised suffering. Eli was the enforcer, built like a bull and twice as mean, with fists that had beaten men to death for the crime of looking at him wrong. Jake was the youngest at 19, still trying to prove himself worthy of riding with his infamous siblings by being twice as vicious as either of them. Together they were wanted for murder, robbery, and rape across 3 territories, but wanted was different from caught, and caught was different from punished. They came for the bank first, riding straight down Main Street in broad daylight like they owned the world and everything in it. Thomas met them in the street with his hand resting easy on his gun and his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never backed down from a fight in his life. "That's far enough, boys. Banks close for your kind of business." The words were calm, professional, the tone of a peace officer doing his job without theatrics or bravado. Buck Kerrigan laughed, the sound like nails on slate in the suddenly silent street. "Well, looky here, boys. A real live lawman in this godforsaken hole. Tell me, Sheriff, you got family in this town? A wife, maybe? Be a shame if something happened to her while you were playing hero." The threat was delivered with casual malice, and Thomas felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest as he realized this wasn't going to end with words. The gunfight lasted less than 30 seconds. Thomas was fast, faster than most men who'd lived long enough to regret challenging him. But he was 1 against 3, and the Kerrigans hadn't survived this long by fighting fair. Buck's first shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. Eli's shot shattered his gun hand, sending his Colt spinning into the dust. Jake's bullet punched through his chest, and as Thomas fell to his knees in the middle of Main Street, he could see Marguerite running toward him from the schoolhouse. Her face white with terror, and her hands reaching for him as if love alone could stop bullets or heal wounds that cut too deep for any earthly remedy. Thomas died in Marguerite's arms, while half the town watched from windows and doorways, too terrified to interfere or help. His last words were whispered against her ear as his blood soaked through her yellow dress and painted her hands red. "Run, mon amour. take what money we saved and run far from this place. They'll come for you next." But grief has its own gravity, and Marguerite found herself unable to leave the place where they'd built their brief, shining dream together, unable to abandon the grave where she'd buried her heart along with her husband. The Carrigans took what they wanted from the bank and rode out laughing, but their departure felt more like a promise than a reprieve. They'd killed the only law in 50 miles and gotten away clean, which meant Redemption Creek was now theirs, by right of conquest. The territorial governor sent condolences and promises of a new sheriff when circumstances permitted, which everyone understood to mean never. Good men didn't volunteer for suicide missions, and wearing a badge in Redemption Creek had become exactly that. Marguerite buried Thomas on a hill overlooking the town he'd died trying to protect, the same hill where they'd picnicked on Sunday afternoons and planned the house they'd never build. She spoke the words of committal herself, because the preacher had developed a sudden case of discretion when it came to associating with the widow of a man who died opposing the Carrigans. The schoolhouse stood empty after the funeral, parents too frightened to send their children somewhere the new widow might bring danger, and Marguerite too broken to pretend she could teach hope to young minds when her own faith in goodness had died with her husband. The first month of widowhood passed in a haze of grief and growing isolation. Neighbors who'd attended her wedding suddenly found reasons to cross the street when they saw her coming. Shopkeepers who'd smiled and chatted while Thomas was alive now served her with nervous efficiency and obvious relief when she left. The whole town was holding its breath, waiting to see what the Carrigans would do about the woman who'd dared to love their victim, and whether standing too close to her would mark them for destruction as well. By the second month, the answer became clear. Windows at her cabin were broken in the night, her garden was trampled, her well poisoned, her mare found dead in the pasture with her throat cut. No one investigated the crimes because there was no one left to investigate them. And no one offered help because helping Thomas Dubois' widow was tantamount to declaring war on the men who'd killed him. Marguerite learned to sleep with a gun, to check every shadow, to live with the constant knowledge that each sunrise might be her last. Because some sins are too great for killers to leave witnesses, and loving a lawman was apparently a sin that demanded the ultimate payment. Hope arrived in the unlikely form of Judge Harrison Morrison, the same traveling magistrate who'd married Marguerite and Thomas on that golden October morning that felt like a lifetime ago. Morrison was old-school justice personified, white-haired, stern-faced, and possessed of an unshakable belief that law was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. He'd known Thomas personally, had recommended him for the position in Redemption Creek, and the young sheriff's murder had hit him like a personal affront to everything he'd spent 40 years trying to build in the territories. "Mrs. Dubois," he said, removing his hat as he stood in her cabin doorway, his eyes taking in the boarded windows and the shotgun she kept within easy reach. "I've come to offer you something your husband died believing in, justice. The territorial governor has authorized me to impanel a grand jury, and with your testimony, we can see the Carrigan brothers hang for Thomas's murder." His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, but Marguerite had learned to recognize the difference between legal theory and frontier reality. The trial was held in the saloon, the only building large enough to accommodate the proceedings, with 12 good men and true pulled from towns up to 50 miles away because no one in Redemption Creek was willing to serve on a jury that might anger the Carrigans. Marguerite testified in a black dress with her hands folded and her voice steady, recounting the events of that terrible morning with the precision of someone who'd replayed every detail 1,000 times in her nightmares. She identified the shooters, described their threats, and watched as Judge Morrison scribbled notes with the satisfied air of a man who believed words on paper could stop bullets. The Carrigans weren't present for their trial. Of course, they were somewhere out in the Badlands, probably laughing about the widow and the old judge who thought courtroom proceedings mattered more than smoking guns. But justice had been served in the legal sense, with guilty verdicts pronounced and death sentences handed down in absentia. Judge Morrison promised Marguerite that bounty hunters would bring the killers to account, that the law had a long arm and a longer memory, that Thomas's sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten or forgiven. For 3 days after the trial, Marguerite allowed herself to believe that maybe the nightmare was finally over. She swept out the schoolhouse, thinking about reopening it for the fall term. She visited Thomas's grave and told him about the guilty verdicts, how his killers would hang for what they'd done. She even bought fabric for a new dress, something in blue instead of mourning black, and began to imagine a future that didn't revolve around fear and grief. But frontier justice was different from courtroom justice, and some men considered legal proceedings nothing more than an inconvenience to be dealt with in the most direct way possible. The gunslinger arrived in Redemption Creek on a horse as black as midnight, his appearance so perfectly timed that Marguerite wondered if he'd been summoned by her desperation itself. From her window, she watched him ride down Main Street with the casual confidence of a man who'd seen every form of hell and found them all manageable. He was tall, lean, dressed in black from his hat to his boots, and he moved with the fluid grace of someone for whom violence was just another skill, like reading or arithmetic. His name was Raphael Montclair, and even in the backwater of Redemption Creek, people had heard whispers of his reputation. He was a killer for hire, but not the kind who took money for murdering innocents. His specialty was other killers, the sort of human predators who thought their reputations made them untouchable. Stories followed him like shadows. The 5 men he'd faced in Tombstone and left bleeding in the dust, the corrupt sheriff in Silver Falls who'd made widows and orphans until Montclair made him a corpse, the gang of claim jumpers who'd learned too late that some debts could only be paid in blood. Marguerite watched from behind her curtains as he tied his horse to the rail outside what used to be the sheriff's office and stepped onto the boardwalk with spurs that sang like funeral bells. He was maybe 35, with dark hair touched by premature silver at the temples and eyes the color of winter storms. His face was hard-carved, marked by old scars and older sorrows. But there was something in the way he moved that suggested a man who'd once been gentle before the world taught him that gentleness was a luxury good men couldn't afford. He stood in the street for long minutes, taking in the boarded windows, the nervous faces peering from doorways, the general atmosphere of a town holding its breath and waiting for the next calamity. When his gaze found her window, Marguerite felt a shock of recognition that had nothing to do with having seen him before. It was the look of someone who understood what it meant to live with ghosts, to carry grief like a wound that never quite healed. For just a moment, their eyes met across the dusty street, and she saw something flicker in his expression that might have been pity or understanding or something deeper. Then Buck Kerrigan's voice shattered the moment, like a gunshot, calling from the saloon steps with the lazy arrogance of a man who owned everything he could see. Well, well, Raphael Montclair, the famous widowmaker, what brings death incarnate to our little slice of paradise? The confrontation that followed would change everything, but as Marguerite gripped her windowsill and watched 2 predators circle each other in the dusty street, she couldn't know that the stranger with dead eyes had come to Redemption Creek for one reason only: to keep a promise made to a dying sheriff who'd begged him to protect the woman he'd left behind. 3 weeks earlier, in a military hospital outside Fort Davis, Thomas Dubois had lived long enough to grab Raphael Montclair's wrist with fingers slick with his own blood and extract a promise that would haunt them both. The 2 men had never met before that moment, but dying men sometimes see with clarity that transcends ordinary human connection. And Thomas had recognized something in the gunslinger's eyes that made him believe his final request wouldn't fall on deaf ears. "My wife," Thomas had whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own labored breathing. The doctors had done what they could, but 3 bullets and 2 days of hard riding to reach help had taken their toll on even his strong constitution. Marguerite Dubois, in Redemption Creek. The Carrigans they'll come for her. Someone has to protect her." His grip tightened with desperate strength, and Raphael found himself looking into the eyes of a man who was dying not from fear of death, but from terror of what his absence would mean for the woman he loved. Raphael had been passing through, recovering from his own injuries after a job in El Paso had gone sideways and left him with a bullet crease along his ribs and a bounty on his head. He'd stopped at the fort to resupply and rest his horse, not to collect deathbed commissions from strangers. But something in Thomas's desperate plea had reached past the walls he'd built around whatever remained of his conscience, and he'd found himself nodding agreement before his practical mind could object to taking on a job that offered no payment except the satisfaction of keeping one more innocent from harm. She's everything good in this world," Thomas had continued, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Teaches children to read, believes in justice, thinks there's hope for places like this. The Carrigans killed me to send a message, but they won't stop there. They'll hurt her because she dared to love a lawman, because she stood up in court and told the truth about what they did." His eyes had closed then, and for a moment Raphael thought the sheriff had slipped away. But then Thomas spoke again, his words carrying the weight of a final request. Promise me you'll keep her safe." The promise had seemed simple enough when Thomas breathed his last an hour later. Ride to Redemption Creek, assess the situation, eliminate the threats, and move on to the next job. Raphael had built his reputation on exactly that kind of straightforward problem-solving, and 3 outlaws with delusions of invincibility were hardly the most challenging contract he'd ever accepted. But that was before he'd seen Marguerite Dubois standing at her window, before he'd recognized the particular brand of courage it took to continue living when everything you'd built your life around had been torn away. Now, as Buck Carrigan swaggered down from the saloon steps with his brothers flanking him like wolves, Raphael felt the familiar cold settle into his bones that preceded every killing. These were the men who'd murdered a good sheriff and spent months terrorizing his widow, and they were about to learn that some promises were kept in blood and gunpowder. "Buck Carrigan," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the street. "I've been looking for you." Buck Carrigan stopped halfway across the street, his pale eyes studying Raphael with the calculating interest of a man who'd stayed alive by accurately measuring threats. "Is that so? And what business might the famous Raphael Montclair have with humble travelers like ourselves?" His tone was mocking, but his right hand had moved imperceptibly closer to his gun, and his brothers were spreading out to give themselves better shooting angles. They'd heard the stories, too, and they hadn't survived this long by underestimating dangerous men. "You killed Sheriff Thomas Dubois 3 months ago," Raphael said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man stating facts rather than accusations. "Shot him down in this street like a dog. Then you've been terrorizing his widow, trying to pressure her into changing her testimony. That kind of behavior tends to attract my attention." He stood perfectly still in the dusty street, but there was something in his posture that suggested a coiled spring ready to release devastating violence at the slightest provocation. Eli Carrigan laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the tense silence. "You planning to arrest us, Gunslinger? Because last I checked, you ain't wearing no badge. You're just another killer for hire, and we ain't done nothing to earn your professional interest." He was the largest of the 3 brothers, built like a grizzly bear and twice as mean, but even he seemed nervous about facing down the man whose reputation preceded him like a gathering storm. "Who says anything about arrest?" Raphael replied, and the quiet menace in his voice made several townspeople who'd been watching from doorways suddenly decide they had urgent business elsewhere. Some crimes call for courtrooms and judges, others call for more direct solutions. Terrorizing widows falls into the second category. His coat moved slightly in the breeze, revealing the ivory-handled Colts holstered at his hips, and Buck Carrigan's eyes narrowed as he calculated odds that kept coming up bad. Young Jake Carrigan, all of 19 and desperate to prove himself worthy of riding with his legendary brothers, made the mistake that would cost them all dearly. "You think you're fast enough to take all three of us?" he sneered, his hand dropping toward his gun with the quick-draw confidence of youth that had never been truly tested. "Maybe it's time someone cut down the famous Raphael Montclair and showed the world he ain't nothing but another—" The words died in his throat as he found himself staring down the barrel of a Colt that had appeared in Raphael's hand with supernatural speed. None of the witnesses would ever be able to say exactly when the gunslinger had drawn. Only that one moment his hands were empty, and the next Jake Carrigan was frozen with his own gun half clear of leather, sweat beading on his forehead as he realized how close he'd come to dying for the crime of running his mouth. "Boy," Raphael said softly, "the next time you reach for that gun around me, you better be planning to use it. Because I surely will be." From her window, Marguerite watched the confrontation unfold with her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. She'd seen enough gunfights in her 3 months of widowhood to recognize the signs. The way the street had cleared, the terrible stillness that preceded violence, the way the stranger held himself like death incarnate waiting for an excuse to collect souls. Part of her wanted to run, to hide in her bedroom and wait for the shooting to stop, but a larger part couldn't look away from the man who'd appeared like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared to speak. The Carrigans were backing down, and that fact sent shockwaves through her system like nothing had since Thomas's death. These were the men who'd terrorized an entire town, who'd killed her husband and spent months making her life a waking nightmare. And they were retreating from a single gunslinger who'd faced them down with nothing but reputation and iron nerve. For the first time in months, she felt something other than fear and grief. She felt hope, fragile and dangerous as spun glass, but real enough to make her hands shake. "This ain't over, Montclair," Buck Carrigan called as he and his brothers began their retreat toward their horses. "You got no legal standing here, no authority to interfere in our business. The territorial governor might have fancy words about law and order, but this is still the frontier, and frontier justice cuts both ways." The threat was delivered with all the venom Buck could muster, but it couldn't disguise the fact that he was backing down from a fight he wasn't sure he could win. Raphael watched them mount up with the patient stillness of a predator who knew his prey would return when they thought they had better odds. "Tell you what, Buck," he called, as the 3 outlaws wheeled their horses toward the edge of town. "Next time you boys decide to pay a visit to the Widow Dubois, you make sure to bring enough men to finish what you start. Because I'm going to be here, and I don't believe in giving second chances to men who make war on women." As the Carrigans rode out in a cloud of dust and muttered curses, Marguerite felt her legs give out and found herself sitting heavily on her kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the sudden reprieve from terror that had become her constant companion. The stranger was still standing in the street, and now he was looking directly at her window with those winter storm eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. She should have been afraid. He was obviously dangerous, probably as deadly as the men he'd just faced down. But instead, she felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. She felt protected. The decision to go outside and speak to him should have required careful thought and consideration of propriety, but Marguerite found herself moving before her mind could catalog all the reasons why a respectable widow shouldn't approach a gunslinger in broad daylight. She opened her door and stepped onto her small porch, suddenly aware of how she must look in her faded black dress with her hair coming loose from its careful arrangement. "Sir," she called across the distance between them, her voice carrying more clearly than she'd expected. "I believe I owe you my thanks." Raphael approached her porch with the careful movements of a man accustomed to being feared, his hands visible and non-threatening as he removed his black hat in a gesture of old-world courtesy that seemed oddly formal from someone who made his living with violence. Up close, Marguerite could see the details that distance had hidden, the network of small scars on his hands and face, the way his eyes constantly moved to assess potential threats, the unconscious grace of someone who'd survived by staying one step ahead of death for longer than most men managed to stay alive at all. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer than she'd expected, carrying traces of education and refinement that seemed at odds with his reputation as a killer. "My name is Raphael Montclair. I knew your husband briefly before he passed. He asked me to look after you, and I intend to honor that request." The words were simple, matter-of-fact, delivered without drama or expectation of gratitude, but they hit Marguerite like a physical blow because they meant Thomas had been thinking of her protection even as he lay dying. "You knew Thomas," she whispered, her hand moving instinctively to her throat where his wedding ring hung on a chain beneath her dress. "When? How?" "I thought. The army said he died alone at the fort." The idea that her husband's final moments hadn't been spent in solitude, that someone had been there to hear his last words and perhaps offer comfort, was almost too precious to believe. She'd tormented herself for months with images of Thomas dying afraid and alone, calling her name with no one to answer. "He spoke of you at the end," Raphael said gently, and something in his expression softened as he watched her absorb the information. "Told me you were everything good in this world, that you taught children to read and believed in justice. He was worried about what the Carrigans might do to you. Asked me to make sure you stayed safe. It was important to him that you know he was thinking of you when he died, that his last thoughts were of protecting you even when he couldn't be here to do it himself." Tears were flowing down Marguerite's cheeks now, but they were different from the bitter tears of grief and fear she'd shed for 3 months. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of the overwhelming emotion that comes when you discover that love transcends death and finds ways to protect you even from beyond the grave. "He sent you," she said, the words barely audible. "Even dying, he found a way to keep me safe. Oh, Thomas, my darling Thomas." Raphael stood quietly while she wept, his presence somehow managing to be both protective and respectful of her grief. When she finally looked up at him again, her eyes red-rimmed but clearer than they'd been in months, he spoke with the careful formality of a man making a binding contract. "Mrs. Dubois, the Carrigans will be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come because backing down in public isn't something men like that can afford to let stand. When they do come, they'll be looking to settle scores with both of us. I need you to understand what you're getting into if you accept my protection." "What am I getting into?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Some forms of safety came with their own dangers, and some guardian angels carried guns instead of harps. "War," Raphael said simply, his winter storm eyes never leaving her face as he delivered the single word that would define everything that came next. "The Carrigans won't give up on you just because I faced them down in the street. They'll regroup, bring more men, try to find ways to get at you when I'm not around. Accepting my protection means accepting that this town is about to become a battlefield, and battlefields are dangerous places for civilians." Marguerite considered his words, while the afternoon wind played with the hem of her black dress and stirred the dust in the street where her husband had died. 3 months of living in terror had taught her that there were worse things than danger. There was the slow death of spirit that came from being helpless, the corrosive fear that ate away at everything good until nothing remained but the hollow shell of survival. "What would you need from me?" she asked, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "Trust," he replied immediately. "Complete, absolute trust in my judgment when it comes to your safety. If I tell you to stay inside, you stay inside. If I tell you to hide, you hide. If I tell you to run, you run without asking questions or looking back." The Carrigans fight dirty. They'll use you against me if they can, threaten you to make me hesitate, hurt you to make me angry and stupid. The only way this works is if you follow my lead without question." The terms he outlined sounded like prison, but Marguerite recognized them for what they were, the hard-earned wisdom of a man who'd kept other people alive in impossible situations. "And in return?" she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Men like Raphael Montclair didn't work for free, and widows like her didn't have much to offer except gratitude and whatever small savings Thomas had left behind. "In return, I promise you what your husband asked me to promise him," Raphael said, and his voice carried the weight of an oath sworn on something more sacred than money or personal interest. "No one will hurt you again. Not the Carrigans, not anyone they bring with them, not any other predator who thinks a widow is easy prey. You'll sleep safe at night, walk through town without fear, and live to see justice done for Thomas's murder. That's my word, Mrs. Dubois, and my word is the only currency I've got left that's worth anything." Marguerite looked at this dangerous stranger who'd materialized out of nowhere to offer her something she'd thought lost forever. The possibility of a life without constant terror, the chance to honor Thomas's memory without dying for the privilege. It should have been an easy decision, but accepting protection from a killer meant accepting all the moral complexities that came with it. Still, as she thought of her husband's face and the promise that had brought Raphael to her door, she knew there was really only one answer she could give. "Mr. Montclair," she said, extending her hand with the formal dignity of a woman sealing a contract that might save her life or damn her soul, "I accept your protection, and I pray that God forgives us both for what we're about to do." The next 3 days passed with deceptive peace that felt like holding your breath underwater, necessary but unsustainable. Raphael took up residence in the small room behind the abandoned sheriff's office, close enough to respond to trouble but far enough away to preserve Marguerite's reputation in a town that already whispered about the widow who'd attracted a killer's protection. He moved through Redemption Creek like a shark through still water. His presence both calming and ominous as folks tried to figure out whether his arrival meant salvation or just a different kind of danger. Marguerite found herself settling into routines she'd forgotten were possible. For the first time in months, she slept through the night without jerking awake at every sound. She reopened the schoolhouse and found that half the children had returned, their parents cautiously optimistic that maybe their town could be safe again. She bought supplies without checking every shadow, tended her small garden without wondering if someone was watching from the tree line, and felt the constant knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen just enough to let her breathe freely. But safety was a luxury that came with its own complications. Each evening, Raphael would stop by to check on her security and discuss any conversations that began as purely business, but gradually evolved into something more personal. She learned that he'd been educated back east, that he could quote Shakespeare and discuss philosophy with the same ease he handled firearms. He learned that she'd left a comfortable life in New Orleans to teach on the frontier, that she believed in redemption for even the hardest cases, and that beneath her gentle exterior was a core of steel that impressed even him. "You don't have to do this alone," she told him on the third evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Carry all this weight, I mean. Thomas used to say that some burdens are too heavy for one person, that sharing them makes everyone stronger." She was thinking of the shadows she sometimes saw in his eyes, the way he seemed to carry the weight of every life he'd taken and everyone he'd failed to save. Raphael was quiet for long minutes, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup she'd given him, the same blue ceramic one she'd saved for Thomas each afternoon. "Mrs. Dubois," he said finally, "I appreciate the sentiment. But some weights can't be shared. Some sins stick to a man's soul like tar, and all you accomplish by getting close is getting dirty yourself. Your husband was a good man who deserved better than dying for doing his job. Don't let my protection cost you more than it gives you." She wanted to argue, to tell him that everyone deserved someone who cared whether they lived or died with honor or despair. But before she could find the words, the sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful evening like a gunshot through glass. Raphael was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun as he counted the riders silhouetted against the dying light. 8 men, he said grimly. "The Kerrigans brought friends. Get inside, lock the doors, and stay away from the windows. The war just started." The attack came at midnight with the ruthless efficiency of men who'd spent their lives making other people's nightmares come true. Raphael had been expecting it, had counted on Buck Kerrigan's pride, demanding some kind of response to being humiliated in front of the whole town, but expecting trouble and being ready for it were two different things entirely. 8 against 1 were odds that challenged even his legendary skills, especially when the 8 included the 3 most wanted men in the territory and 5 hired guns who'd answered their call for backup. The first shot shattered Marguerite's kitchen window and buried itself in the wall 6 inches from where she'd been standing moments before. Raphael's return fire came from the sheriff's office, precise and deadly, dropping one of the attacking riders from his saddle before the man knew he'd been targeted. 7! He called across the space between buildings, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden chaos of gunfire and shouting men. "Anyone else want to try their luck?" Buck Kerrigan's answering laugh was harsh and ugly in the darkness. "Give up the widow, Montclair, and we'll let you ride out of here breathing. This ain't your fight, and that woman ain't worth dying for." Thomas Dubois learned that lesson the hard way. The words were calculated to provoke, to make Raphael angry enough to do something stupid. But the gunslinger had been controlling his temper in life-or-death situations since before Buck Kerrigan was old enough to hold a gun. "Counteroffer," Raphael replied, his shots punctuating his words as he kept the attackers pinned behind whatever cover they could find. "You boys mount up and ride out now, and I'll let you leave with most of your pieces still attached. Stay here and keep shooting at that lady's house, and I'll kill every last one of you before sunrise. Your choice, but choose quick. I'm getting bored, and bored makes me creative." Marguerite huddled in her bedroom with Thomas's rifle across her knees, listening to the battle rage around her small cabin and trying not to think about what would happen if Raphael fell. She'd seen what the Kerrigans did to people who crossed them, knew that her death would be neither quick nor merciful if they managed to get their hands on her. But worse than the fear of dying was the fear of living with the knowledge that another good man had died protecting her, that her very existence seemed to be a magnet for violence and tragedy. The siege stretched through the long hours of darkness, punctuated by brief exchanges of gunfire and longer periods of tense silence as both sides waited for opportunities that might not come. Raphael moved like a ghost through the shadows, changing positions constantly, making 8 men feel like they were fighting a small army instead of a single defender. But ammunition was finite, and even the best gunfighter needed sleep eventually. As dawn approached with no sign of the attackers retreating, Marguerite realized that winning this battle might require sacrifices that neither she nor Raphael was prepared to make. Dawn brought no relief, only the harsh revelation that the Kerrigans had no intention of backing down from a fight they'd escalated beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. 3 more hired guns lay dead in the street, but 5 attackers remained, and they'd settled in for a siege that could last days if necessary. Raphael was running low on ammunition and lower on options, his usual tactical advantage neutralized by enemies who were willing to wait him out rather than face him in direct confrontation. "Montclair!" Buck Kerrigan's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "You've got until noon to send out the widow. After that, we start burning down every building in this town until someone decides she ain't worth protecting anymore. Think about all those families, all those children who'll suffer because you decided to play hero for a woman who ain't even yours." The threat hit its target with surgical precision, and Marguerite felt the walls closing in around her like a tomb. Innocent people were going to suffer because of her, because she'd accepted protection that had turned into a war nobody could win without devastating casualties. Through her window, she could see faces peering from other buildings, frightened families wondering if their homes would be next, children who couldn't understand why their safe world had suddenly become a battlefield. "I have to go to them," she said when Raphael appeared at her back door during a brief lull in the shooting. "I can't let other people pay the price for my safety. Those children in the schoolhouse, the families who welcomed Thomas and me into this community, they don't deserve to suffer because I was too selfish to solve this myself." Her hands were shaking as she reached for the door handle, but her voice was steady with the kind of resolve that comes from making peace with terrible decisions. Raphael caught her wrist before she could open the door, his grip gentle but implacable. "Mrs. Dubois, if you walk out there, you'll be dead before you take 10 steps. And your dying won't save anyone. It'll just encourage men like the Carrigans to keep using terror as a weapon. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else fight for you, especially when that someone gave his word to a dying man that he'd keep you safe." "But at what cost?" Marguerite demanded, tears streaming down her face as she thought of all the ways her survival could destroy the lives of people she cared about. "How many innocent people have to die so that I can live? How many children have to grow up without fathers because I was too weak to face my own problems? Thomas died protecting this town. I won't let his sacrifice be twisted into something that brings more death and suffering." Raphael studied her face for long moments, seeing the pain and guilt and desperate courage that was threatening to drive her into making a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "Then we end this," he said finally, his voice carrying the finality of a man who just made his own peace with dying. "But not by surrendering you to murderers. By giving them exactly what they've been asking for since they rode into this town. A chance to face me in a fair fight, winner takes all, no more innocent people caught in the crossfire." The challenge was delivered with the formal courtesy of an earlier age, when honor still meant something, and duels were settled by skill rather than treachery. Raphael stepped into the street at high noon with his hands empty and his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the besieged town. "Buck Carrigan, you claim to be a gunfighter, but all I've seen is a coward who hides behind numbers and threatens women. How about we settle this like men? Just you and me. Right here. Right now." Winner walks away. Loser feeds the vultures. The challenge caught Buck off guard, and Marguerite could see the calculation in his pale eyes as he weighed the risks and benefits of accepting. Facing Raphael Montclair in single combat was suicide. Everyone knew the stories, the reputation that preceded the gunslinger like a grim shadow, but refusing the challenge in front of his men and half the town would mark him as a coward, and cowards didn't last long in the leadership of outlaw gangs where respect was earned at gunpoint. "Awful confident for a man who's been pinned down all night," Buck called back, but there was uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there before. "What makes you think I'm fool enough to face you alone when I've got 7 men who'd be happy to put you in the ground?" The question was a stall, an attempt to buy time while he figured out how to refuse without losing face completely. "Because 7 men against 1 isn't a fight, it's an execution," Raphael replied, his tone carrying the casual menace that had made him legendary. "And because deep down, you know this town isn't big enough for both of us. One way or another, this ends today. Question is whether you've got the backbone to settle it like a man, or if you're going to hide behind hired guns and let everyone see what kind of yellow dog you really are." The insult hit its mark, and Buck's face flushed red with anger and wounded pride. Around him, his men were watching, waiting to see if their leader had the nerve to back up his reputation with action. Too much of his authority depended on being the most dangerous man in any room, and that authority would evaporate if he backed down from a challenge issued in front of witnesses who would carry the story across 3 territories. "All right, Montclair," Buck said finally, his voice tight with the knowledge that he was probably walking into his own grave. "You want to die today, I'm happy to oblige. But when I put you down, The widow comes with us. No more protection, no more interference, just a settling of accounts that's 3 months overdue." He began walking toward the center of the street, his hand resting on his gun butt, and Marguerite felt her heart stop as she realized she was about to watch the man who'd promised to protect her risk everything on a single draw that could end both their lives in the space of a heartbeat. They faced each other in the dusty street where Thomas Dubois had died 3 months earlier, two men whose reputations had been built on the graves of those foolish enough to challenge them. The sun hung directly overhead, eliminating shadows and leaving nowhere to hide from the judgment that was about to be rendered in gunpowder and lead. Every window in Redemption Creek framed a face watching the confrontation that would determine whether justice or chaos ruled their small corner of the world. Buck Carrigan was fast. Faster than most of the men he'd killed. Faster than Thomas Dubois had been on that terrible morning when the law died in this same street. His hand moved to his gun with practiced precision, clearing leather in a draw that would have made him the hero of any other story. But this wasn't any other story. And Raphael Montclair wasn't any other man. The gunslinger's Colt appeared in his hand like magic, faster than thought, faster than fear, faster than the eye could follow. The two shots came so close together they sounded like one. But only one man remained standing when the echoes faded into silence. Buck Carrigan swayed on his feet for a moment, looking down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with the confused expression of a man who'd never imagined his own mortality. "That ain't possible," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief and approaching death. "Nobody's that fast. Nobody—" "Today somebody was," Raphael said quietly, holstering his gun as Buck crumpled to the dust. He turned to face the remaining Carrigans and their hired guns, men who'd suddenly realized they were staring at their own probable deaths if they chose to continue a fight their leader had just lost. "Any of you boys want to argue the point? Or are you smart enough to take your dead and ride out of here while you still can?" Eli Carrigan was the first to break, his massive frame shaking with the knowledge that all the muscle in the world meant nothing against a man who could draw and fire faster than lightning. "This ain't over," he growled, but the words lacked conviction, delivered by a man who'd just watched his brother die and knew he could be next if he pushed his luck. Buck had friends, had connections, people who won't let this slide. "Then send them my way," Raphael replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd faced down threats before and lived to tell about it. "I'll be right here, keeping my promise to a dead sheriff and making sure his widow lives to see justice done. But understand this. Anyone who comes for her comes through me, and I don't believe in giving warnings twice." The surviving outlaws mounted their horses with the hasty efficiency of men who'd suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Young Jake Carrigan looked back once as they rode out, his face twisted with grief and rage. But even he was smart enough not to challenge a man who'd just proved his legend was built on more than reputation. As the dust settled on their departure, Marguerite emerged from her cabin and walked toward the man who'd just saved her life for the second time, her heart full of gratitude and terror and emotions too complex for simple words. In the silence that followed the gunfight, Redemption Creek felt like a town holding its breath, waiting to see if the violence was truly over or if this was just another brief respite in an ongoing war. Marguerite stood beside Raphael as the undertaker emerged to claim Buck Carrigan's body, her hands shaking with delayed reaction to everything she'd witnessed. The man who'd terrorized her for months was dead, but his death had come at a cost she was only beginning to understand. "It's not finished," Raphael said quietly, his eyes scanning the empty street for threats that might still be hiding in shadows. The Carrigans had connections, like Eli said. Men who won't appreciate having their reputation for invincibility shattered by a single gunfighter in a nowhere town. "We've won a battle, Mrs. Dubois, but the war is far from over." His words were meant as warning. But Marguerite heard something else in them. the weary acceptance of a man who'd been fighting other people's battles for so long he'd forgotten what peace felt like. The townspeople began emerging from their hiding places with the cautious movements of prairie dogs checking for hawks, their faces showing a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They'd wanted the Kerrigans gone, but they hadn't expected the solution to come in the form of a gunslinger whose reputation for violence exceeded even that of the men he'd driven off. Some threats were easier to live with than others, and a protector could become a problem if he decided to stop protecting and start controlling. "They're afraid of you now," Marguerite observed, watching the way people crossed the street to avoid getting too close to Raphael. "They're grateful, but they're also terrified. You represent something they don't understand. Violence for good reasons instead of evil ones. It challenges their ability to separate heroes from villains." She understood their confusion because she felt it herself, torn between gratitude for his protection and unease at the cold efficiency with which he'd ended Buck Kerrigan's life. Raphael nodded grimly, recognizing the pattern he'd seen in dozens of other towns where his intervention had solved immediate problems while creating longer-term complications. "Fear's a tool like any other, Mrs. Dubois. Sometimes it keeps the peace better than kindness or law ever could. But you're right. Eventually they'll decide I'm more dangerous than whatever I'm protecting them from, and they'll find ways to encourage me to move on." "That's how it always ends." "And what happens to me when you leave?" Marguerite asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart since the moment she'd accepted his protection. She'd grown accustomed to feeling safe, to sleeping through the night without nightmares, to living without the constant weight of terror. The thought of returning to that existence, or worse, facing new enemies who saw her as an easy target, made her stomach clench with dread. Raphael was quiet for long minutes, and when he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested he'd been thinking about the same question. "I made a promise to your husband, Mrs. Dubois. I promised him no one would hurt you again, and I meant it. But there are different ways to keep people safe. And not all of them involve staying in one place forever." The cryptic answer raised more questions than it answered. But before Marguerite could ask for clarification, the sound of an approaching rider drew their attention to a new problem that would change everything once again. The rider who approached Redemption Creek 3 days after Buck Kerrigan's death looked like he'd been carved from granite and tempered in hellfire. Captain Wade Morrison of the Texas Rangers sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to command, his badge catching sunlight like a promise of justice that wouldn't be denied. He was maybe 45, weathered by decades of chasing the worst humanity had to offer across the most unforgiving landscape in America, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of calculating intelligence that made dangerous men nervous. "Raphael Montclair," Morrison called as he dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent his career making hard men answer difficult questions. "We need to talk. Official business, courtesy of the state of Texas and a federal marshal who's been tracking the late Buck Kerrigan for the better part of 2 years." The formal tone suggested this wasn't a social call, and the way Morrison's hand rested casually near his gun indicated he was prepared for the conversation to turn unpleasant. Raphael emerged from the office with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to read threat levels in the way other people read weather. Rangers were different from local law, more professional, less corruptible, and infinitely more persistent when they set their sights on someone. "Captain Morrison," he said with polite acknowledgement, "I assume this is about recent events in your jurisdiction. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the Kerrigan matter." "Oh, I'm sure you are," Morrison replied, but his tone suggested the opposite. "See, the thing about killing wanted men in public gunfights is that it tends to attract attention from people who track such things for a living. Buck Kerrigan had a federal bounty on his head. $5,000, dead or alive. That's a considerable sum, and it raises questions about your motivations for being in Redemption Creek at the exact moment he decided to make his last stand. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a recently fired gun, and Marguerite felt her blood turn cold as she realized what the ranger was suggesting. From her window, she could see the two men facing each other in the street, and the tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. If Morrison believed Raphael had come to town as a bounty hunter rather than a protector, it could unravel everything they'd built together and leave her defenseless against whatever enemies remained. "You think I came here for money?" Raphael said, and there was something dangerous in his voice that made Morrison's hand shift imperceptibly closer to his weapon. "You think I spent 3 days under siege, risked my life in single combat, and killed a man in front of half the county because I wanted to collect a federal bounty?" The words were delivered with the kind of cold fury that preceded violence, and Marguerite found herself holding her breath as she watched two armed men circle each other like wolves. "I think you're a killer for hire who happened to be in the right place at the right time," Morrison replied steadily, showing no sign of backing down from a confrontation that could leave one or both of them dead in the street. "I think you saw an opportunity to collect easy money and decided to wrap it up in a pretty story about protecting widows and honoring dying men's last wishes. The question is whether you're going to come quietly to answer some questions, or whether we're going to have problems that end with more graves being dug in this godforsaken town." Before either man could make a move that would turn conversation into carnage, Marguerite stepped out of her cabin with Thomas's gun in her hands and steel in her voice. "Captain Morrison," she called, her words cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Before you arrest or shoot the man who saved my life, perhaps you'd like to hear the truth about why he's here and what really happened 3 days ago." Her appearance shifted the dynamic completely, introducing a third element that neither gunfighter had been expecting. Morrison's pale eyes flicked toward her, taking in the widow's black dress, the determined set of her shoulders, and the way she held the rifle like someone who knew how to use it. "Mrs. Dubois, I presume. I knew your husband by reputation. He was a good man who deserved better than dying in the street like a dog. If you have information relevant to this matter, I'm prepared to listen." His tone was respectful but skeptical, the voice of a man who'd heard too many lies to accept stories without verification. "Mr. Montclair didn't come here for bounty money," Marguerite said clearly, her voice carrying to every window where townspeople were watching the confrontation unfold. "He came because my husband asked him to protect me. Thomas knew he was dying, knew the Carrigans would come for me next, and he extracted a promise from a stranger to keep me safe. Everything that's happened since, the confrontation, the siege, the gunfight, all of it was about honoring that promise, not collecting federal rewards." She told the story completely, holding nothing back about her months of terror, Thomas's final request, and Raphael's unwavering commitment to keeping his word to a dying man. As she spoke, Morrison's expression gradually shifted from suspicion to understanding, and finally to something approaching respect. Rangers dealt in facts, and the facts as Marguerite presented them painted a picture very different from the bounty-hunting scenario he'd constructed. "You have witnesses to this deathbed promise?" Morrison asked Raphael, his hand moving away from his gun as the immediate threat of violence receded. "Medical personnel at Fort Davis who can corroborate your story?" The questions were still official, but the hostility had gone out of them, replaced by the professional curiosity of a lawman trying to piece together a complex puzzle. "Dr. Samuel Fletcher," Raphael replied promptly. "He was treating Sheriff Dubois when I arrived at the fort. Nurse Catherine Walsh was present during our conversation, and Sergeant Major Patrick O'Brien witnessed the promise being made. All three will testify that I accepted no payment and asked for no compensation beyond the satisfaction of honoring a dying man's final request." The quick availability of corroborating witnesses impressed Morrison, who dealt with enough guilty men to recognize the difference between truth and careful fabrication. Morrison was quiet for long minutes, weighing everything he'd heard against his professional instincts and years of experience separating honest men from clever liars. Finally, he nodded slowly and holstered his weapon completely. "Mrs. Dubois, Mr. Montclair, I apologize for the misunderstanding. The federal bounty on Buck Carrigan remains unclaimed, and based on your testimony, it will stay that way. Sometimes justice comes from unexpected directions, and sometimes the best lawmen are the ones who don't wear badges." As he prepared to mount his horse and ride away, Marguerite felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying, the fear that her protector might be taken away just when she'd learned to trust in safety again. 6 months later, as autumn painted the Texas landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Marguerite stood at Thomas's grave with Raphael beside her and wondered at how much had changed since that terrible night when the Carrigans had shattered her windows and her peace of mind. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with the words, "Thomas Dubois, beloved husband, faithful sheriff, guardian of justice." But beneath those formal phrases lay the true measure of a man who died protecting others and found a way to keep protecting them even from beyond the grave. "I kept my promise," Raphael said quietly, his words meant for the dead man who'd trusted a stranger with his most precious responsibility. "She's safe, Thomas. The Carrigans are gone, their reputation destroyed, their network scattered to the winds. No one will hurt her again, not while I draw breath, not while I have strength to hold a gun." The vow was renewed, rather than completed, because some promises transcend their original terms and become lifelong commitments that death itself cannot dissolve. Redemption Creek had indeed been redeemed, transformed from a town living in fear to a community where families could build futures without looking over their shoulders for approaching danger. The schoolhouse was full again, children learning to read and write and dream of possibilities that extended beyond mere survival. New businesses had opened, new families had arrived, and the general store now carried books alongside bullets because civilization had finally taken root in soil watered with too much blood but nourished by the sacrifice of good people who'd refused to surrender to chaos. Marguerite had changed too, evolved from a terrified widow into a woman who'd found strength she never knew she possessed and peace she'd never thought she'd feel again. The black mourning dress had been replaced by colors that reflected life rather than death. And while she would always carry Thomas's memory in her heart, she'd learned that love could expand rather than simply transfer from one person to another. "What happens now?" she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer from the way Raphael had been talking about moving on, about other towns that needed protection, other promises that demanded keeping. "Now you live," Raphael replied, turning to face her with those winter storm eyes that had seen too much death but still held capacity for tenderness. "You teach children. You help this town grow. You find happiness in whatever form it takes. You honor Thomas's memory by building the kind of life he wanted you to have, the kind of future he died trying to secure." His hands found hers in the gathering dusk, scarred fingers intertwining with smooth ones in a gesture that spoke of comfort rather than passion, protection rather than possession. But instead of the goodbye she'd been expecting, Raphael surprised her with words that rewrote the ending of their story completely. "Unless," he said softly, "you'd like some help with that living. I've spent most of my life keeping promises to dead men, Mrs. Dubois. Maybe it's time I made some promises to a living woman, if she'd be willing to accept them from a man whose past is written in gunpowder and grief." As the last light faded from the Texas sky and the first stars appeared overhead, Marguerite realized that some stories don't end with justice served or promises kept. They end with new promises being made, new dreams taking root, and two damaged souls discovering that healing is possible when you stop running from the past and start building toward a future worth protecting.